One element of this course I know is going to appeal to our next speaker. It's the thesis. Now, what is wonderful about the thesis on this MSc course is it can be written on the student's experience in their own startup business. You get access to the SIT Tech Park and investors, or you have access to the business network partners such as Sergey was saying, Acronis, Citrix, Microsoft, McKinsey and Company, as well as in the SIT leading research laboratories as well. Now, I really want to stipulate this level of engagement with business is extremely rare in highly technical master's degrees from other specialist universities. Now, our next speaker is very, very rare as well. I'll tell you why. He's a developer, he's an entrepreneur, he's an investor, he's an advocate of the open source philosophy. Our next guest is a perfect example of the types of people you will have access to and be influenced by at SIT and this new wonderful Masters in Science course. He perfectly encapsulates the spirit of SIT, and even more excitingly, our next guest will be giving some lectures as part of this MSc program. If that hasn't sold them enough, nothing will. You know who he is. He's Professor Michael Widenius. He's founder, he's CTO of MariaDB, founding member of MySQL, founder and GP of OpenOcean VC firm. There's so much wonderful stats about Monty, but all I need to say is one, MySQL is the #1 database for 25 years and has more running instances than all other SQL databases combined. I think I'll zip up now. Monty, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for the kind words. So, I'm having prepared today a talk for software developers who want to create better software, and also entrepreneurs. And actually, being a software developer and entrepreneur at the same time is a really, really rare breed. But we do need more of those. And that is what I hope to encourage with this talk. Next slide. So I believe that open source is a better way to do software. Next slide. And here you have the most common reasons for why open source is just better. By the way, all these slides are meant to be used as a reference for future. So I will not go through all parts of the slides. I will hope that you can take this and use them in the future as a reference, and I hope that SIT will also, when they publish a video of these talks, also include the slides separately to make things easier for you. But I think that the most important things, not from a developer point of view, but for user point of view, is that by using open source, you are in charge of your own future. You don't have to depend on another company who goes out of business and the software disappear or they remove things. You can ensure that this is software that you can continue using basically forever. And that's why MySQL and the successor MariaDB is still going strong after more than 25 years. Next slide. So the reason I started to use open source was that it was good software, it was free, it was easy to use. But I very soon learned that it's also a better way to develop software, because you can find ways to enhance your software in ways that you never expected that you could do before, because you get ideas from the outside. And you get, of course, more developers, more eyeballs. That's basically why Linux is so popular and stable, just because you have so many different people looking at things. But even if open source is a better way to develop software, it's extremely hard to create a profitable company developing open source. And when we started with MySQL in the old days, people basically told me that there's no way you can make money by giving away everything for free, because you will not have enough money to pay developers and so on. Fortunately, with MySQL, we were able to prove them wrong, and I hope that's the next slide would also give you the advice how to do the same. Next slide. And this is a great quote from Bruno Lavaghi. Why it's so hard to make money on open source? Because if people and companies can use it for free, because your license is too forgiving, there's no way that you can make enough money. And he changed his license from being Apache software, which is very, very free license, to another one that more restricted, and that was the way that he was able to save his company. Next slide. So when you talk with open source advocates, there is a somewhat of a religious aspect of it. Some people believe that open source will save everything and you don't need to take care of money because it will come up by itself. But unfortunately, there is no guarantee that you get enough money working with open source to be able to develop and support your product. And when me and David Axmart went open source with MySQL, we did it very, very carefully and with great thought to be able to assure that we would get enough money to create a sustainable company and be able to work on it full time without having to do things on the side. Next slide. And I think this is probably the most important slide of the whole deck. Why license is important? Because most of the open source companies, at least in the past, they were basically service companies where the source was available for free, and they only provide the support, training, and consulting to help run the project and also enhance it. But that also means that if they earn 1 million and they go to investor, the investor will say that, okay, your company is worth 2 million. But if they would instead do licenses or do have something that will ensure that a part of the users has to pay, either by licensing closed source software or something, then revenue is totally different. And it basically 10x the revenue. So with MySQL, at the time we were sold to Sun for $1 billion, we had a revenue of some 70 million. And 70 million times 10, and we also had some 20 to 50 million users. That gave us a valuation of 1 billion. But if we would only have done services, we would only have been worth around 200 million. So it's a big change, especially when you talk with investors. And that's why licensing is so important. Slide. So why go open source? There's lots of reasons, but if you want to compete with really big vendors, then you have less money to do that. You need a different strategy. And open source is a way to get out the product to everyone who needs it, and also get development done at a much lower cost than traditional software, because you have a community to help you. So you basically get free marketing and free help and better bug reports. For example, with MySQL, during the first 5 years, we didn't have any salespeople, we didn't have any marketing, we didn't have any lawyers, and we still was making good money just because we did it, get things right. Next slide. And this slide is kind of important because it tells you why people or users are going to use your software. And with open source, especially in today's time, it's very important that you don't have a vendor lock-in, because why would you risk your whole business on a vendor that you can't trust completely. If you use a commercial database, how do you know that what is the cost for the next license that when you have to renew, or what happens if the vendor drops the project? And even worse is what is there is hidden trapdoors in the product. And that's also, for example, while China is very restrictive for their future software, they want to be sure that there is no trapdoors. And there's also other companies who say the same things about China. If everything would be open source, we wouldn't have this discussion. Next slide. For developers, it's obvious why open source is better. You get the freedom to change things, fix bugs, have other people helping your bugs. Usually you don't have to do this because most successful open source software have a company behind them, so they can help you. But you have the freedom to be able to do things yourself and not depend on others. And you can also learn great things from great software. Next slide. What is important to understand when doing business on open source is that there's a lot of different licenses. In practice, you only have to care about these 5. And if you create a project, don't use any other licenses because that will just confuse your users. And the public domain on the top is the most free one. Basically, you can do anything with it. And the lower you go down, the more restrictions there are in how you can use the software. But restrictions also gives business opportunities. Next slide. So when looking at things of how to make money on open source, it's not that many different models that exist. The most common one that people refer to is open core. And then you have dual licensing, what was MySQL was using, and then you have service models. The service model had a problem is that you don't get enough money to do things. Subscription, donations, and foundation. But the next slides will go in all of these in great detail. So next slide. So open core is the most common one. And what it means is that a base part of the product is open source. You can use it in any way you want. But then there are modules that you have to pay for. And this is a great business model. Lots of companies are doing that successfully. But if you're looking at it with the eyes on open source user, or if you want to keep the freedoms that open source promises, basically open core removes all of those. In practice, as soon as you're depending on one single module, it is like a closed source product because you can't fix things, you're depending on one vendor, and so on. It doesn't mean that it's not a good business model, but there are betters. And this has nothing to do with open source because some things are closed. Next slide. So dual licensing, that's what we use with MySQL. And in some sense, we are using also with some project around MariaDB. So we were GhostScript was the first project to use dual licensing. MySQL was the second, but we were the most successful in doing that. So the idea is that all code is free, everything is open source, you can use it according to the open source license. But we used a license that had some restrictions, and with MySQL we use GPL. And GPL is great in the sense that if you are working with open source, you can use GPL almost any way you want. But if you have a closed source product, you can't use GPL as part of that, because GPL says that everything that you've attached to this code will also become GPL, in other words, free. And big companies doesn't like that. So what we earned money on was not only support, but giving companies like Adobe the right to use MySQL, but under another license than GPL. So they wouldn't have to make Adobe open source. And a big part of the income that we got from MySQL came from these license deals. And it was because of these license deals, we had a valuation of 10x the revenue instead of just 2x. And GPL works greatly for infrastructure projects, things that people want to embed in their product, like Adobe wanting to embed MySQL into their product. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for all projects. A GPL, which is like a GPL but affects things on the internet. So if you have a service offering on the internet where some parts of it is a GPL, you have to publish all your code as open source to all your users. And that's why a GPL is a way to also earn license revenue from big vendors. Next slide. The problem is that if your product is not an infrastructure product, or things that embed like a music player, none of the previous versions really works for you. And that's why David Axmark and me created the business source license, which is a way for people who believe in open source, create more open source, but also be able to create a company that actually can do revenue. So the idea is quite simple. All source code is available from the start, so all the freedoms that the developer needs is there. But it's not an open source license in the beginning, but it will become one because the license in every software file tells you that at this date, this code will be totally free as an open source license. And that means that you can depend on this in the future, because even if the vendor goes away, you can still continue to use the software. Maybe you have to pay for the software for 1 or 2 years, but after that you are free and you can still innovate and develop it while you're working on it. So next slide. So the benefit for users of business source is that no vendor lock-in, all source code is available, exactly what you would expect from an open source. You have to pay the vendor if you're going to use the latest version, but if the older version is good enough, or you can wait, then you will eventually be free of the payments, except of course if you want to have the support and the latest version. But so this is basically a unique breed between conventional closed source licenses and open source, and will in the long run create more open source software. Next slide. So the recommendations that we tell people that, if they should decide to use business source license, don't make it too long before making it free, because in that case you don't get the spread of this software that you want. And for those people that you decide that should pay, only target a small piece, because you want to have the spread of open source. You want to have the developers helping you succeed. And if you do like in MySQL, we had a target that only 1 in 1,000 should pay. If you have enough users, that's a really, really good business. Next slide. So here's some links that you can look at later, discussions about open source. Bruce Perens has also written a very positive blog about business source, and as a good way for those companies who can't afford to do fully open source in the beginning. Next slide. And of course, there's lots of confusions about why did we do this. The reason we created open source was actually nothing to do with MySQL or MariaDB. I mean, we created business source. It was so that the OpenOcean Capital, my investment company, we could more easily invest into great software companies who wanted to be open source but didn't have a business model. By helping them adapt to the business source license, they can create a sustainable business and also allow us to do investment in the company without the big risk of losing money. Next slide. There's some projects who are using it. BSL is still new, but Cockroach database recently switched to Business Source, MaxScale at the MariaDB Corporation, and Kafka tools are using it. And we hope that lots of new entrepreneurs will see the benefit of Business Source and using it. Next slide. There's also other version that is a little bit like BSL, but basically they say that you can use this software for free in these cases you have to pay. But the big difference with BSL is that we guarantee that the license guarantees that the software will eventually be open source in a short time frame, while the other licenses doesn't. Next slide. So the Commons Clause license basically looks like this, but we can skip to the next slide. And there are also other kind of BSL licenses, but they all have the problem is that you're still depending on one company for doing that for all future, and that's why I like BSL much more than these licenses. Next slide. So the importance of licenses, without having a way to get a certain amount of people to pay for MySQL, we would never have been able to succeed. We would never have been able to pay developers. Subscriptions are good. You really need those. You want to give customers excellent support, and companies are prepared to pay for it. But unfortunately, if they don't have to pay, a lot of companies will not pay. And that's perfectly okay with open source software, that you have lots of people or companies who are not paying, but you have to have some companies to pay, otherwise you will not succeed. Next slide. So what made MySQL successful? The license was probably one of the most important aspects, but we did also lots of other things that was totally different back then. We were a virtual company from the start, basically hiring developers everywhere, everybody working from home. In Corona times, this is the perfect way to do business, and this is what we're doing with MariaDB. I also wrote 30,000 emails helping people during the first 5 years, and I believe that that was what helped bootstrap MySQL, and also enable us to get a very positive user base who helped bootstrap MySQL. And that was 20 minutes and the end of my talk. Thank you.